What's good, y'all? Welcome to another episode of Conversation Piece, the podcast about the missing pieces of the conversations we're already having right here in Indianapolis. I am so excited to be back with you for 2024, the rest of 2024, the year of the nap. And before we get into today's conversation, I want to let you know we're recording this episode the day after the election. And a lot of things are being said right now. A lot of feelings are being felt. And a lot of people are feeling a type of way. And I just want to let you know that if you are feeling isolated, alone, scared, whatever it might be, that you're not alone in that, and that there is community out here for you, whether it be here in the city, whether it be somewhere else in the state, whether it be across the country. There are people here for you. And as we move through the rest of 2024 into 2025, into new futures, into old futures, whatever that might look like, we're going to continue to do the work here to have conversations that break through the malaise of the constant fear of what's different and what might happen, and move towards what we can do together as a community and collectively. So just wanted to share that message because that's what we do here on the show. That's where we want to go with the show, and we want to make sure that we are a platform for y'all to feel safe enough to share if you need to, in whatever way that might be. So with that being said, my guest today is a multifaceted human creating in multiple forms of art, whether it be sonics, phonics, or something in between. She is a creative project manager, a recording artist, and a fellow podcaster. And you can hear her lean into and live her mission of inspiring growth and healing through creativity, sharing authentic stories, building intentional community, and guiding others to reconnect with their faith and artistry every other Tuesday on the Keys and C's podcast. She's got a lot going on. So without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to welcome Kyndl to the show. Kyndl, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Absolutely.
I'm a fan of the show, so I'm excited.
Ever since I was put on game of Kyndl's work, but also when you came up to me at the 100th episode and introduced yourself, I felt like we were kindred spirits, no pun intended, in not just the medium of podcasting, but in the act of storytelling, and wanting to, as a friend of the show, Madeline says, ask better questions, which is what I really appreciate about the work that you do. So I'm excited to be able to sit down and have this conversation. Yeah. It feels like a long time coming, even though we haven't known each other that long. And I'm excited to dig in.
God's timing.
For sure.
And vice versa. I really respect and admire how intentional you are about the work that you do. And I can tell you're really dedicated to it. So in the world of, any and everyone having a podcast, real journalists are still important. So
I appreciate that. I gave you a little bit of an introduction, but for people who are listening or watching right now who don't know who you are, do you mind sharing just a little bit more about yourself?
I'm Kyndl, formerly known as American. I am a music artist. I'm a podcaster. First and foremost, I'm a follower of Christ. And I'm just a girl. I'm just a girl on a never-ending journey of finding herself, and I share that journey with others however I feel led to.
I love it. Do you remember the very first time that you tapped into and then expressed your creative self?
So I've always been a writer. As a kid, just keeping a diary, I stayed with a notebook and a pen. And so me finding an outlet in journaling and, keeping a diary, that transformed into short stories. I thought I wanted to be an author at one point. I still might add that to my resume, of course, but that then transformed into poems and songs. And I grew up in church, and so I grew up singing in the choir. I was a part of the marching band in high school. So it was like music and writing has always been there. And so it just got to a point where I'm like, okay, I feel more confident now to share what it is I've been, writing in private. And so,
What were some of the things, you don't have to share specifically, but the things that you were diving into while you were journaling? Was it just expression of what's happening in the day? Or was it I want to tell a specific kind of story? What did that look like when you were getting started?
So my journal entries were my outlet of how I felt, what I was going through. I was very reserved as a kid. And so that was my safe space. And so,
For sure. You also talked about being in marching band. And I wanted to ask how foundational your experiences were as a member of the Gold Brigade Color Guard, as well as being president of Class Act.
Yes. So I was a part of the color guard. And so when you see the marching band perform, the girls with the flags, like that was what I was part of. So we all practice at the same time though. And so band camp is crazy. And so I remember really going hard about the fact that color guard is a sport because a lot of people don't recognize it as a sport, but it's a lot of training and conditioning and showing up.
And you compete and you go to
yes,
state
we
stuff,
compete.
national stuff. Like
my whole summer, all throughout high school, it was gone, but that's what I loved to do. And so that played a foundational role in me being disciplined and committed to something that also helped build my confidence as well. That was like my first time, performing in a way. And being the president of Class Act, I don't know, I've always just had a natural, I guess, knack for being a leader, and other people around me have seen it. And so having that opportunity is what thrusted me more into a space of, okay, I can, take on leadership roles and continue to put myself out there.
Well, I think with Class Act, you were creating like community for other young women, correct? In the school, I think. Or Am I reading? Did I read that correctly?
Yeah. So it was a group at Warren. I graduated from Warren Central, and shout out to Miss Mason. She was what's the word I'm looking for?
Advisor
in a way. Yeah. So she created the group, and I essentially was just the president of the group. And so it was a personal development type of organization for young women. And so, of course, just the things that I took in with that really played a role. I remember there was like a declaration or like an affirmation that we had to say at every meeting. And I still remember it to this day. I'm a lady of poise, class, and sophistication. I'm of high character, high values, and standards that exhibit respect and leadership at all times. Like we had to say that every meeting. And so, it's just little things like that just began to be planted within me. Like, okay, I am that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's important because had you not had that experience, maybe in like introverted Kyndl doesn't step into that role because they said you keep like what you're journaling is like you keep some of that. It's a lot of what you're feeling to yourself. But in Class Act, you get a chance to lead and maybe not express any of those things, but like tap into something that you weren't tapping into before.
Yeah. And I've always been someone who enjoys being in community, but I do not like the aspect of all eyes being on me. And so I was very against being the president, but she saw something in me and she's like, no, you need to be the president. And so from there, I'm grateful for that experience. And so again, it's just different opportunities like that I had that really started to bring me more out of my shell as an introvert.
Yeah. I heard you say once that you learned early that all things were possible, just not for me. Was that, so I'm asking that question because I feel like Class Act and Miss Mason putting you in that position opened up possibilities. But then there's this other aspect at play of you can see possibility, but for whatever reason, there's a reflection of, or maybe not a reflection of yourself. Am I reading that a little bit right? Because I think part of that might have to do with coming up on the far side or the far east side of Indy and like the culture and like trying to grow up in a way that is resistant to like narratives that are being placed upon a specific place that you're coming from.
Yeah.
And I feel like when I heard that and then I was hearing you talk about this story, it's like kind of like two opposing forces that are trying to reconcile with each other in the work that you do. Yeah,
I would say that's a reoccurring theme of my life for sure. Of course, as a kid, you have a big imagination, and I believe, God has a plan for all of us, and we just have to grow up and realize what that plan is. And so I've always just had this inner knowing of knowing that I want more for myself and I see more for myself, but the reality is, I'm growing up in poverty and, so a lot of times it's hard for me to just stay encouraged, just as an individual when I know that I'm also on a path that I don't see a lot of people on.
Sure. Yeah. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, or maybe painting a picture of the Far East Side, especially when you were coming up? I think, especially as somebody who did not grow up in Indianapolis and who is now like trying to figure out, okay, what is the city about? I'm learning about the different neighborhoods and areas that make up the city.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I never heard of these areas before. And also I'm wondering if my idea of what these places are being shaped by not the people that I know, but by other narratives that have been placed by other institutions and things like that. So I was wondering, I wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about like, and paint that picture for us, what the Far East Side is like for people who probably have misconceptions about it.
Right. So I do want to say that when you're growing up as a kid, all you know is all you know, right? And so it wasn't until I got older where I realized like, oh, we might not have been staying in the best areas, but again, it's community. It's when you're in community with other people.
Yeah.
It's, I guess what I'm trying to say is when you're in it, it's different from how other people may view it. And so the East Side, that was home. My family grew up on the East Side. And so, just going outside and playing with the different kids that's also in the neighborhood, it's like we related to each other. We understood where each other was coming from. And I think a lot of times there's a disconnect between people who have different realities. And so I think the East Side itself, it gets a rep for our crime. But I think the East Side is just an area that is not as, I guess, resourceful. Like we don't, like we're resourceful with what we have, but I don't think the East Side itself benefits from a lot of resources that other areas. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. So yeah, and of course, when you're in survival mode, you know, essentially you're going to have the good and the bad. But I think that's with any city, any area.
Sure. Well, I think what's really interesting is that, especially the music scene, as I delve into more of that here, I'm like, okay, a lot of the really incredible music is coming from this area. I'm like, what's happening here? Like, what are we missing that we need to know about and that we need to be investing in to help people who are coming from here who clearly are tapping into some creative energy that we as a city could benefit from? Like, how do we need to be seeing that? So I appreciate you sharing, because I think, like you said, there's this disconnect if you're not really in it. And even like you said, you left and then you came back and it gave you a different perspective.
For sure.
But I love the way you talk about where you come from and the city itself, because there is like the true authentic love as somebody who is from here as opposed to somebody who just is visiting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember, just to add another point, growing up, because, Indianapolis is not a California or, I remember like going to school and people would like lie about where they're from. Like, oh, I'm not even from here. And I remember like as a kid, I'm just like, but you are from here. Like
I know you though.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't get that. Yeah. So there would be times where people would lie about where they're from. And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, who I am is shaped by the fact that I'm from here. So if you're from here, what is there to be, ashamed of,
Sure. And I think that pride shows through, especially in like your music, but in your writing and the stuff that you talk about on the podcast. I think the pride in Indy and the Far East Side where you come from really shows through. And I do think that's interesting that you bring this up. I'm on Threads. I don't post a lot on Threads, but I see a lot of people post on Threads. And something I see a lot is people complaining about Indianapolis and be like, "There's nothing to do in Indianapolis. Indianapolis is a terrible town. There's nothing
and
here."
And those are the same people who do not go outside.
Exactly. And I'm like, well, and then you look at their bio, like it says Fort Wayne. I'm like, well, hold on a second. You don't even live here. But it's just like, we feel entitled to opinions that we shouldn't even have because we don't actually have lived experience with the things that we're complaining about.
Yeah.
And again, I just appreciate you even just giving us that definition of like what that means and explaining that, because people, it's easy to lose, it's easy to fall out of line with that understanding. When did your creativity and all of this coalesce into music? So you said you were always in choir, you were doing that, but when did you decide to take the leap to artist? From like, I'm a journaler, I performed in the color guard. How does all that marry into, okay, I'm going to become an artist in that way? Right.
So at first I was a little insecure about it. I'm not going to lie, because I'm like, I feel like I'm a late bloomer, right? But it wasn't until I got to college where I realized that music was a passion that I had. Because like I said, music was always around me and I've always been a writer. But I think it was also a confidence thing. And so once I got to college and I was just exposed to more, and I'm also around other artists, and there's, different open mics and,
Yeah.
things like that. But also, too, just becoming a fan of music. I've always been a music enthusiast first.
Yeah.
So even in high school, I remember I had a blog. I forgot to mention that. And I would just share just what I was listening to because that's something that I enjoy doing. So just from being a writer and being a fan of music and also being a fan of going to concerts, it became a point where I'm like, oh, I could do this.
Yeah.
And so, again, it was just a confidence thing. I was always writing music, even in high school. And so it wasn't until I got to college where I was about to graduate. I was a junior. This was April of 2018. I graduated 2020 during the pandemic, hot mess. But I remember I was a junior in college, and you know how you have those conversations like, okay, I'm about to graduate. What am I about to do with my life? And it was just one of those moments where I'm like, I'm just about to take the leap and just start sharing my music. And I remember when I first shared something, it was like everyone on campus was like, oh, she's a rapper. We finna have her at our events. And it was like, it was just immediate validation of like, oh, okay, I guess I do this now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
That immediate validation.
Yeah, I'm
but I think it
grateful.
speaks to you had been working on the craft for a while, like your whole life essentially, but especially it sounds like in college, you started to dabble a little bit more in the songwriting or song crafting of it.
Yeah.
To be able to then have something ready to go
For sure.
when you became a junior.
For sure.
I know that you released your first album or your first project, Chaotic.
Yes.
Senior year, sold out show, big event.
Yes.
And I think it's really interesting now to think about it as coming off within a year, within a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that accelerated process for you within that year? Like, what were you experiencing as you were after that immediate validation? What was your next, like, I need to do this? And how did that lead into that project?
So because it was immediate validation and music was something that I realized at that point was something that I enjoyed doing, I'm like, okay, well, I'm just about to keep writing. And so I was always writing music. And so I just began just putting it out. And because I received validation early on, I think it was just an immediate, I guess, demand for me to release a project. And so I did release my first project within that year. But something that also happened during that year was I found out about this opportunity to audition for Rhythm and Flow on Netflix. And I found out about that opportunity maybe like 4 or 5 months after I had first started rapping. And it was something that I didn't want to do because at the time I'm a college student, that was my main thing at that time. But I took a risk on myself, and that was the opportunity that solidified, like, okay, I'm on the right path. And long story short, I ended up not, making it through. I just auditioned.
Yeah.
But from there, I kind of had this chip on my shoulder. Like, oh, okay.
Right.
I know that I really have the talent. If I could make it to an opportunity like that this early on, okay, this is what I do now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I love that. Because, again, I'm thinking about young Kyndl who is journaling and is like, I don't have that confidence yet.
Yeah.
And is like, and then I'm just hearing in your story this building and then it's bubbling and then it's just like, okay, this is a pop. And now I'm going to go. And then to see that success, which is, I love that you bring this up because this is something that I wanted to talk to you about. You have this immediate success with releasing music. Then you have a huge first project release, which is something that doesn't happen very often for new artists. Especially you're doing this in Muncie, Indiana, right? You're doing this at Ball State?
So I had my release show here in Indy.
Oh, it was here in Indy.
On the east side. I was going back and forth from school. But majority of what I was doing was around campus.
So you knew what to do. You were tapping into your people, the people who knew you and who were fucking with you already. Yeah. Okay, so you have that success. I think that is undeniably a success. Then you have Rhythm and Flow, which said you auditioned for, you didn't go all the way through. But to me, as a bystander, I think that still looks like success. Yeah. And I like the way that you framed it as okay, this is telling me I can do this and I need to continue to pursue this. Yeah. How did that early success coinciding with the pandemic as well, how did that shape you as a person not as an artist, but specifically as a person, and how much of that time was the groundwork that would, well, obviously you've already talked about, like, it was what pushed you there, but yeah, so let's start with that. Let's start with that first question. How did that time, that early success plus like going into isolation because of the pandemic, how did that shape you in that moment? Because I feel like a lot of things are happening, both good and maybe not so good.
Yeah.
Out of your control too.
Yeah. So I graduated college during the pandemic, and it was weird because I had to move back home, like in the middle of all of that.
Yeah.
And so I never saw my senior year going that way, but it also made me show up for myself in a way where I didn't know that I had that within me, because I'm like, why am I finishing my senior year at home? You know? And so I had to wrestle with that, you know, having the strength to roll out of bed and still, you know, do what I have to do. But because I was at home, and we were also robbed of the opportunity of having a graduation ceremony. It wasn't until 2021 where we were actually able to walk the stage. And so it just put me in this weird space of realizing that life can, you know, change into something else in a blink of an eye. And so because college was then also out of the way, and I had all this time to sit with myself, I'm like, okay, well, what do I really want for myself? And I always told myself that once I graduated college, I really wanted to just put, you know, the gas on the music, because I was, you know, doing music, but I was also doing school.
Right.
But I was also, you know, building this buzz for myself as an artist. And so I'm like, okay, I'm about to really take this opportunity to just continue going harder for the music. And so during 2020, I actually dropped 2 projects. And so for me, I didn't stop. But also, too, I ended up moving to Atlanta. And so it was just the opportunity that I saw of me realizing just more of what I wanted for myself. And at that point, I'm like, okay, I see Atlanta as, you know, the next step for me. Because I also feel like at that time, too, as an artist, hearing that, like, I'm seeing that the scene is growing now, but I feel like at that time I was performing at the same type of events for the same type of people. And so at that time, I'm like, I'm not in college. I don't got no kids. I'm about to go move. You know, I can always come back. So that was my mindset.
Like, it was real, like it was stagnant, essentially. Yeah. Like, there was no, like, you weren't seeing new people showing up.
It felt stagnant at the time. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to move and try to push this as far as I can while out there.
Okay. I appreciate you bringing that up, because, and shout out to Skip for bringing up this and opening my eyes to this entire conversation. And we kind of talked about it at the Visual Oral release, which is just the idea of the culture of Indianapolis hip hop, and also like this idea of what the Naptown sound is.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of your perspective on that, because like you said, you know, you were here, and that was, I guess, 2020, like when you were performing, 2018, 2020. Is that period where you felt like it was stagnant, I guess? Is that around that time?
Yeah.
Like, even at that point, feeling that stagnation, which I think is really interesting, thinking about my conversation with Skip and thinking about, I think that comes on the heels of them trying to do a bigger thing within, like, the community. I'll have to revisit that conversation. I could be wrong. But I think you, again, hold a very specific and unique perspective on the scene, because not only were you there then, but you're back now. And you come from having went to Atlanta and spent time there, which is quote unquote a mecca hotbed of hip hop and music. So like, how has your perspective evolved on this particular scene in our city? And what do you want to see? And what would you want to see?
So, to be fair, when I first started rapping, mind you, I was still a college student. So I was a part of the scene here, but in a way, I wasn't as immersed then as I now am. Because my reality at the time was mainly being in college.
Student, yeah.
So I also think that maybe I didn't give it, I guess, like enough time, you know, a fair chance to be more immersed in it. Because after I graduated, I immediately left. And it wasn't until I left where I realized, like, am I missing out? Like, am I out of the loop? Because it did start to feel that way, because from the outside looking in, at that point, I did start to see that there were, you know, more community and more opportunities. And I'm like, either I didn't see it or it wasn't until I left, like around that time, that I started to see just more things pop up, you know, in the city. And so I would say that's how my perspective have changed. Maybe it took me leaving to see like, oh, it's even more here in the city that I didn't even realize was there. And maybe I didn't realize it because I was still a student. But I also, too, think just at that time, just the city was on the up and up. And so I also feel like, to an extent, the reality was a lot of the things that we see now here in the city wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I think it's a valid perspective because, like, you had been shaped by Indianapolis music and stuff. You were blogging about it in high school. Like, you were writing about it. You were listening to stuff, whether it be national or local. Like, you were listening to all things, I'm assuming. And that, like, perspective helps to shape how you make the decision to leave. Like, it plays a role into it, you know? Like, because you're like, okay, I'm not seeing anything, what appears to be happening here. So let me go find it in another place. And sometimes for people, like, you leave and then you're like, oh shit, there was really cool stuff happening. And luckily the opportunity to come back presents itself, so you can come back and immerse yourself in it more, which I think is really interesting. And as you find yourself navigating the scene and being somebody who, I said this about Double A, and I'm going to say this about you, who I think people consider to be like a rapper's rapper. Like, you're somebody who, like, if people are like, oh, you haven't heard of Kyndl, or like, you don't like that, they're the people who, you're somebody who is referenced as like the lyricist, somebody who can like create in that way. At least from my perspective. Sorry. Okay. I don't know if everybody's saying that, but at least that's what it looks like to me in conversations that I've had. So with other people. Yeah. And which is, again, it's how I came across you. Is like people were telling me, oh, you haven't heard of this person. You need to know this person. And so as I listen to your music and I listen to what you do, I'm like, okay, this is why. With that being said, one of the things that we talked about at Visual Oral was like the lack of diversity within the scene still. Yeah. And so I wanted to touch on that a little bit more because I feel like that's not necessarily a conversation we have a lot. And I have not seen being had. And particularly I'm referencing, where are all the ladies at? Where are the women at happening? You were there. Juicy was there. Paris Ladam is another name that I know. And I know that there are more people here, but it seems to be like a quiet secret for whatever reason, as opposed to like, let's be loud about these women who are really running it in this game. Yeah. Does that make sense? There's not a question in there, just like from your perspective, who are we missing out on? And is it another case of under-resourced for women or young girls who want to come up and be part of the music scene, whether it be hip hop, R&B, just vocalists in general, or recording in general? You know? So sometimes I ramble and try and get stuff out, so I apologize.
You're good. I'm just thinking on my thoughts. This might be a little controversial, but I think that it's also a thing here in the city where there's artists who complain about people not supporting them and giving them opportunities, and they think that they're hidden, but really they're hiding themselves. Okay. They're the ones who aren't showing up to events and rubbing elbows. And you can't expect someone to give you an opportunity if they don't know who you are. Sure. And so I also think that, there probably are a lot of great artists out here who we aren't aware of, but are they making themselves known? Sure. So I think that that's a thing, but I also too think that even though the city is very small, a lot of people tend to, although they're known, they stay with their circle of people. Yep. And so I also think that that's a thing too. I know when I first started rapping, because of the style of music that I have, or I guess just the artists that gravitated to me, I found myself in a particular scene within the scene. Sure. But it wasn't until I graduated and, moved and, came back, and I was more so just open to everything else that I started to realize, it's other people that's been rapping and doing this and taking it serious for years too, but I did not know who they were. And it also wasn't until opportunities like Treese, where I realized, it's so many other artists out here that I didn't even know of.
Yeah.
So I think it also just depends on where you are within the city. So yeah.
Well, I think your first point, I don't think it's really that controversial. I've brought it up a lot. I think we've talked about it a lot with other artists, but like you get out of things what you put into it.
Exactly.
And if you're not willing to show up at stuff, or you're not willing to like literally do the legwork of making yourself a little bit more visible. Yes, you can definitely talk about systemic issues that create barriers to visibility.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we also have to be accountable to ourselves and like, what are we doing? If you just release a song on SoundCloud and you do nothing else, like you're not hidden. You're just you're just a SoundCloud rapper at that point. Like you're just putting out music to put out music.
There's artists who want to be taken serious but don't take themselves serious.
Exactly.
But once you decide to take yourself serious, other people will see that you're serious and will take you serious.
Exactly. And to that point, tying together this idea of like people staying in their own silos, like that's part of that, I think, is like, how can we encourage other people to take themselves seriously? Like if you really want to do it, like we need to model for you. Like you need to see the models of people taking it seriously.
Exactly.
And I think when we get into our silos, that's a barrier to some of that visibility for people, because like you said, you can find yourself in the scene within the scene and not maybe realize, oh, there's things happening around me that I should be involved in.
Yeah.
Who were some of the people that caught your eye once you realized, oh, there are other people that are out here doing it, and like, that's cool. I need to connect with that person.
So I told Oreo this story, but I remember when I was younger, there was this channel called Indie's Music Channel. And it was this channel that would just play music videos from, national acts, but also local artists. And so I remember being young. I don't remember how old I was, but it was like one of those seeds that was planted where I remember seeing this music video for John Wayne by Oreo Jones and Sirius. And I remember from there, I'm like looking up on SoundCloud and I'm like, I love these artists. I don't know where they're from, but I love them. Yeah. And then I realized they're from here. And then years later, it was like a full circle moment being an artist, a part of Treese. Yeah. And so I remember telling Oreo that story and he's like, that's so crazy. But like, I believe that story because there's people who come up to me all the time like, yeah, man, I saw your music video in jail. And it's like they're really like the pioneers, you know, within the scene. So shout out to Oreo, shout out to Sirius. Skip is a family friend. So that was also someone who planted a seed at a time where I wasn't even thinking about music. I was watching him up close when he was doing his Skip Saturdays. So when I decided I wanted to start rapping, he like, little kid finna start rapping. Like, so it was like I was always like around it in a way, but it wasn't until I started to put myself out there where someone like a Sirius embraced me. He was one of the first people who put me on one of my first shows. And I also have to shout out Jeremiah Stokes. He's actually the one who gave me my artist name after I rebranded and changed my artist name. He's someone who reached out to me and just wanted to just take me under his wing just as a little sister. So he's put me on so much game, even beyond music. So, yeah. But I think pretty early on, wherever I found myself, people embraced me.
For sure.
So,
Well, I think you have that energy. You have an energy of like, you're not pushing away. Yeah. You know, it's like an energy of like, we can be in community if you want. Yeah. You know, and I think that's a good energy. And I don't think a lot of people exude that often because we've found ourselves in times where it's like, it feels right to be isolated for whatever reason. And maybe that's coming out of the pandemic. Maybe that's other rhetoric, but like, it's refreshing, especially in Indianapolis, to find people who are open to community. Yeah. And who also aren't trying to force it upon somebody if it's not something that they're about.
I think for me, but before establishing myself and introducing myself as an artist, I was genuinely a music enthusiast. So for me, I love just genuinely showing up to an event and supporting another artist. Right. So I think that's where it comes from too.
For sure.
Like being within the scene, but also the artists within the scene who I've met they know that I'm genuinely a fan of their music.
100%.
Like, I'm like a Jake with the shot. I'm just an artist too.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I was thinking about. It's
Yeah.
just like, your fans first. Like
Yeah.
you spent time going to the show and like
For sure.
being like consuming.
And we have so much talent here.
Yeah.
Like, are you crazy?
Well, that's the thing. I was just telling somebody, I don't remember who it was, but like I have a playlist of just like a hip hop playlist, and it has a bunch of national artists on there. But like it is now permeated with Indianapolis artists.
Yeah.
And you could not, if I shared that with people who weren't from here, they would not know that this was not
You
somebody
would not
who,
know.
They would be like, who is this dude that I haven't been listening to yet? It's like, oh, it's somebody from right here. And
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's like the quality
Yeah.
is so high that it is almost disrespectful to everybody doing
Yeah.
stuff here that we're not, like, people aren't more well known.
Yeah.
And I think that like what Oreo is doing with Streets, I think is really awesome, and giving artists like yourself the opportunity to go on TV and perform
Yeah.
and these other things, like especially getting outside of the box of
sure.
what it means to be an artist or a performing artist.
Yeah.
And then again, creating a community that is not just the scene within the scene, but everything outside of that. And like,
Yeah.
how do we connect these dots?
For sure.
Okay, you brought up I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you brought up your rebranding or your new name, or Kyndl, which is the name that you use now. You used to use the name American, and
Yes.
the American had 3 Ks in it, which stands for knowledge and kindness is key. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. That name had, what I think about it when it comes to the use of that acronym, and I was just watching a video about it, so this is why it's fresh in my mind, but I think about it as reclamation, and the way that you described why that was the way that you chose that name stood out to me in that way. And as we've had this conversation, I've been thinking about this concept of what does it mean to take what is mine, rightfully mine? What does it mean to take back what has been taken from me or placed upon me that I want to take as like a term of power as opposed to a term of oppression?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, is like that idea or concept of reclamation something that sits in your work? I feel like when I hear you talk on a podcast a lot, which we're going to go to next, that plays in there, particularly when it comes to like navigating faith and your faith journey. But I was wondering, especially from like a musical or artist perspective, is that something that like permeates throughout as well?
I would agree, but I would say I don't think it's a conscious thing.
Okay.
I think when I chose my artist name, the first artist name, but I know that when I chose that artist name, one, I knew that I wanted my name to have meaning.
Yeah.
I wanted my name to have part of my real identity within it. So I spelled it Ken because Ken, my name. But also, too, I knew as an artist who no one knows, I had to find a way to stand out.
Sure.
And I knew that was going to create conversation. And so I think I've always just had that natural, I guess like instinct within me, but I don't think it's a conscious thing. So I thank you for recognizing that. But that was definitely my intention. I think deeply into a lot of things, but I don't think it's ever a conscious thing. So that was how I came about choosing that artist name. And then once the conversations did start to come about, I'm like, I love the fact that I have this opportunity to expand on what I mean by my name and the different themes that I have within my music. Like, I think for me personally, my favorite part about being an artist is having conversations around the art. Yeah. So that's where I come from, For sure. But also too, I think it also just boils down to being an artist. Like, I think people love artists, but they hate artists because they don't understand artists. And so it's like, in a way, people who are consumers of the art, they want to place artists inside of a box and tell them how they should be and how they should show up and what they mean by it. And it's like, no, I'm the artist. This is what I meant by it. And so I think at a certain point that sort of just got lost in translation. And I felt like the artist name itself became more of a conversation than my music. Okay. And then too, just growing and evolving, I'm like, okay, I kind of want to get away from this and I want something that I feel represents more of who I am. Yeah. And so it was a conversation. And Jeremiah Stokes is one who I had that conversation with. And he's someone who I've always been, just like eye to eye with. And he's understood me, as an artist, as a person. And so that's where Kyndl came about, me relighting the flame. And yeah, so I think for me, it's always been just a desire to have conversations, but not necessarily something that I consciously think about all the time.
Yeah. I love it because, again, it just makes me think like, okay, this has always been here for you. Like you said, you're not consciously tapping into it, but it's something that just continues to seep into the stuff that you do. And especially like even your IG handle is Rekindle, which is it has to be intentional because it's part of like, it's the rekindling of the flame of what you're wanting to do. The flame never went away, but we're going to like put some kindling on the fire and build that back up. And I love that because yes, I do think, especially listening to the podcast, you are a very deep thinker. The early episodes I love because that is what podcasting is about, baby. It is give me the microphone and I'm going to talk and I'm going to be my authentic self.
I was just yapping.
I loved it though
I
because
know what I was going to yap about, but I was
like
yapping.
if y'all want to know Kyndl outside of this episode, go listen to the first like 6 episodes of her podcast because like you're going to learn a lot from her. And I think if you want a lesson in what it looks like to be vulnerable, but to do so in an intentional way, like you're going to find that on those episodes and beyond. And with that, we're going to move to Keys and Seeds. Tell us about it. This is something that I know you've poured a lot into. You're rocking the merch right now. You've got a lot going on with it. You're doing a lot of really incredible things. You just had a friend of the show, Fee Ford on, and you've had Dier on. Like there's a lot of crossover as well. And like you said, you're rooted in conversation. So tell us about the podcast. Tell us how that kind of came about. And
So as I mentioned before I started to release music and establish myself as an artist, I was a blogger. I thought I wanted to be a music journalist or a journalist of some sort. So I remember at a certain point, I'm like, okay, typing, that's a lot, proofreading. And I think just as I matured, the blog just started to fizzle out. But I always have had a love for long form content. I still wanted to express myself in a way where I didn't feel constricted to a 4-minute, 5-minute song and I have to rap and, So I think just because of the times that we're in now, I'm like, let me do a podcast. And so initially the podcast was me just sharing more of who I am in a way where I'm expanding on what I'm sharing in my music, but it's me, I guess, pulling back the curtain even more. And so from there, I didn't really have like a direction for the podcast. I was just talking about what I feel led to talk about. But I think as I've stuck with it and I've taken it, more serious as a thing, the podcast is just my journey of faith, healing, and artistry. So I'm also on a very intentional journey of growing closer to God. I'm also in therapy, and I know that I have wisdom, within me, like, a lot of people do. And I think just the revelations that I've been receiving on my journey, I want to share that. And so with that, I think it's also overlapping with my music because within my music, I've shared those type of things within it. I just haven't, I guess, gone deeper.
Right. You haven't, like you've made the song and it's 4 or 5 minutes, but nobody's gotten the 4 or 5 hours worth of conversation that went into creating the song.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So about halfway through, I would say you made an intentional shift to focus, to bring the faith forward, I think, as part of your bi-weekly release. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I love the intentionality behind it because as somebody who is, identifies as agnostic. I like to hear other people's faith journeys because it gives me perspective on my own journey.
So I would say when I started the podcast, I was someone who knew God, but wasn't as intimate in my relationship with God as I now am.
Sure.
And it wasn't until I went through some very, traumatic things, just going through real life at a place where I'm like, okay, I realized that there's certain things that are just not in my control. And I know that I want to reach a certain place in my life, but is that really where I should be? And so I just started to wrestle with these questions of, okay, what do I want? But also to, what does God want for me?
Sure.
I started to ask myself those type of questions. And I remember at the time, the podcast was just something that I was just doing. You know, it was more of like a hobby. But the music, I'm like, this is what I want to do, like music.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I like slowed down where I realized that the podcast was something that I could use and be more intentional about. And so my faith came into play because literally before we started to record this episode, we were talking about how I view myself as more of a writer.
Yeah.
You know, like I kind of want to hide behind writing something and perfecting that first and then going in the booth and recording that and releasing that. But the podcast I felt was going back to what we were talking about, you know, me viewing myself as an introvert. I just felt spiritually led to just share more of who I am in that way and let people who think that they know me through my music actually get to know me, because I was really in the space where I was wrestling with my faith, but I was also going deeper in my faith. And it also felt like I was in this conflicting space where I touched on it in my music, but I haven't really touched on it in my music.
Sure.
And so the podcast was more so an opportunity for me to invite people into what goes on behind the scenes. Because like you said, people, you know, they receive the song, but they don't necessarily see what went behind what inspired this song.
Yeah. Well, I think the song is like the IG post. And we see everything. We see the feed. It looks great. That's awesome. But we don't see the hundreds and thousands of hours of work that went into getting to the feed.
For sure.
And I feel like, again, I think it really shows through in the conversations that you have with other people, but especially in those moments where you're just leading us yourself and going through that. And again, I bring up the shift because that first run of episodes is like, if you wrote a book, just print that out, print the transcript out and post that as a book, because that's your book. Like you're giving us the context we need to understand like everything that you're about, the shift that you make going forward in the pod, which is what I really love. From this point, like what's 2025 is coming up. What's next for Keys and Seeds? What are you hoping to achieve? What do you, Kyndl, want to see out of it going forward?
Right. So I view the podcast as more than a podcast. I want it to actually be a community of people. Something that I really enjoy doing as a creative project manager. I love planning events. And so I really want to get into just hosting and curating events that are opportunities for community to come together. So I plan to do events next year. Of course, just continuing with the podcast. I am working on another project as far as music. People know me primarily for rapping, but I've sprinkled in, you know, some singing here and there. And I'm leaning more towards doing like my first full R&B leaning project.
Okay.
So I'm excited about that. And so I'm just in a space of just showing more of who I am to people, however I feel led to express that.
I'm here for it. Affirmations, visual oral, go check it out. You can hear a little bit of that singing. It's fantastic. Probably, and it might be my favorite one off of that album. Anyways, as we get ready to wind down here, I got a few more questions for you.
Okay.
The first one being, we've talked about community a lot and that, you know, you can't really do anything alone, even if you do things on your own. Like you're always trying to build. We want to build in community. We have a recurring segment on the show called Give Them Their Flowers, where we ask our guests to shout out one or as many people as they want, whoever they feel deserves their flowers at the moment. So Kyndl, I just want to ask, who do you want to give their flowers to today?
Okay. I give this person their flowers in person all of the time, and their name has already came up, Fee.
Woo!
She is someone who has really been walking alongside me on this journey and has really helped me just see more of what's out there, you know, because sometimes you need that person who you can have conversations with, like, hey, you know, this is the vision that I have, but this is what I'm struggling with. And she's someone who helps me step outside of myself and, you know, really realize what more is possible. So shout out to Fee. Shout out to Drayco. He's actually the one who designed the logo for the podcast.
Okay.
He's also someone who I view as a pioneer within the rap scene, and I don't think he gets his flowers enough for that. He also has a podcast. Who else? Are these like people who inspired me, or just
whoever you
people
think
in the
you want to
city?
give who you think they need their flowers at the moment?
So as a fan of the show, I know that you were going to ask me this question. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I don't want to say like a typical name when he asked me, but a name that I did think of that I don't think this person is expecting me to give them flowers, Diop.
Okay.
He is someone who I have always been a fan of. And not only am I a fan of his music, but I'm a fan of the way in which he moves as an artist and as a person. And I say that because I think sometimes as artists, we feel pressure to constantly be seen in people's face. But I remember it was this period of time where Diop kind of just like disappeared and everybody's like, where is he? And the fact that he always, just comes and goes and he pops back up and he pops back up as a more refined version of who he is, like I really respect that. And I don't think he's someone who's mentioned in a lot of conversations either. So shout out to Diop.
Shout out Diop. Just talking about him yesterday with our buddy Nick Smith, a.k.a. Man Dog. So yes, absolutely.
Shout out to them. And I'm sure there's going to be people who I forget, but we know who they are. The names that come up often, the double A's, the Skips, I want to give my flowers to anyone that's within the space pushing the culture forward.
For sure. Those are all amazing people. And like you said, there's a lot of incredible people out here doing that work. And
the Jakes with the shots, the artists who aren't even artists, in the way in which we tend to think about artists, but are supporting other artists. So
100%. Shout out to Madeline McKinnon, Frida's Flowers, for sponsoring this segment. We're going to get, this is a gift for you, so you get to take that one home. But we'll figure out flowers for everyone else. I have 3 more questions real quick. The first one is a fun one because it came from the podcast. You said that you have a fan fiction on YPad. Okay. I just wanted to ask you about that. If there's anything that you can share about any of that, any fanfic, can we go find that? Is it still readily available? Anything that you could share about your fan fiction writing?
It is available still. I feel like it's kind of cringe. But like I said, I've always just been a fan of music and a writer. And so I used to write fan fiction about artists that I'm a fan of. So they're still out there, but it's like,
I'll be here for it. I heard you talk about it and I was like, okay, I got to ask about that when she comes on the show. So we'll find them. We'll find them and we'll post them in the show notes maybe. Okay. Second to last question. A message for any young person in the city who is trying to make it in any particular art scene right now. What would what message would you share with them?
Know your why. Know your why. Know who you are. And stay rooted in that and tethered to that. I think a lot of times people jump into things for the wrong reasons. And I wouldn't say that I did that, but I think along the way I did kind of lose my way and I started to feel like I had to make the type of art that other people wanted me to make. And so I think just in general, people aren't as sure about who they are and why they're doing it. And so from there, they might lose their way or they might find themselves in, spaces and opportunities where, things might backfire. And I think there's a lot of artists too who, they complain because they had bad experiences. And I think a lot of times people don't take accountability for the experiences that they have. So I would just say, just know who you are and know your why. And from there, you'll not only be aligned with what's for you, but you also will steer clear of what's not for you.
Could not have said it any better myself. That is absolutely perfect. Kyndl, thank you so much for coming by the show. Sitting down and sharing so much that you've shared, and especially dropping some of these gems, not only about the community, but how we move forward as artists, and especially about your work. Last but not least, where do we find you? How do we follow you? How do we support you, Kyndl the artist? How do we support Keys and C's the podcast after this?
So as far as social media, you can follow me as an artist, which is also doubled for my, just personal page at Rekyndl, REKYNDL. A lot of people think that my artist name is Rekyndl, but that's just my social media handle. It's Rekyndl. And then my artist name itself on all music platforms, KYNDL. I also have a Bandcamp that has my full discography. It has some things that's not on DSPs. So kyndlmusic.bandcamp.com. For the podcast, Keys, X, Seeds, Pod. And I have a new website. So my website, which houses everything, if you want to know more about who I am and you want to have the links to everything, keysxseeds.com.
Love it. Very aesthetically friendly website. Very user friendly as well.
Thank you.
Shout out to whoever did your website. It was
Me.
good. You did a great job. Kyndl, thank you so much for being here again. It's a fantastic conversation. I can't wait to have more conversations with you and maybe talk about some of these spin-off projects that I had mentioned before we got on mic.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. For everybody else, new episodes of the show every Tuesday on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Conversation Piece Pod on Instagram and TikTok for all the social media stuff. Conversation Piece Podcast on YouTube specifically. I don't know why I brought that up again, but conversationpiecepod.com for merch, the archives, and everything else that you might need. We're closing out 2024 strong. We have some really incredible conversations come up, including a name that was mentioned on this episode. So I can't wait for that. But until then, I've been Patrick Armstrong. This has been Kyndl. That's been Mike. That's been John. This has been Man Dog's Painting. This building has been patterned inside of the studs on Capitol Avenue in Indianapolis. And this has been Conversation Piece. See y'all soon.